The morning sun cast a dull glow over the cracked pavements of the Los Angeles neighborhood where David Morgan resided. The air was thick with the acrid smell of garbage and despair, though David's small house stood out in sharp contrast. Despite its peeling paint and sagging porch, his lawn was meticulously trimmed, and vibrant patches of flowers poked defiantly through the decay. It was a facade, a fragile barrier between his inner turmoil and the chaos beyond. David, a tall man in his late 40s, limped as he moved from the kitchen to the front room, the old injury in his right leg a constant reminder of the horrors he'd left behind. He had fought in some of the fiercest battles overseas, a decorated veteran of a war that had left his body battered and his mind scarred. Every step came with pain, but the ache in his soul was sharper. Years ago, during a mission gone terribly wrong, his unit was ambushed in a remote valley. David survived. His comrades did not. Guilt and sorrow were etched into his features, and his blue eyes often seemed to gaze at something no one else could see. The neighborhood, much like David, was a shadow of its former self. Once lively streets were now dominated by the Iron Street Crew, a gang whose grip tightened daily. Led by a man known only as Scorpion, they painted their territory with violence and fear. Businesses closed early, residents spoke in whispers, and graffiti marked the crew's dominance. David avoided them as much as he could. His life revolved around maintaining his solitude, repairs to his house, tending to his garden, and sitting on the porch when he could bear the outside world. But even that reprieve was haunted by the clamor of distant gunshots and the rhythmic bass of cars speeding through the streets. On one such afternoon, as David adjusted a loose plank on the porch railing, a cheerful voice broke through his thoughts. "Hi, Mr. David." Tommy, the 3-year-old boy from next door, waved energetically, holding up a toy truck missing one of its wheels. "It broke again." The boy's parents, Sarah and Mark, had recently moved in, seemingly unaware, or perhaps desperate enough not to care, about the area's reputation. Reluctantly, David put down his tools and limped to the edge of the porch. "Let me see," he grunted, taking the toy with practiced care. Tommy's wide, hopeful eyes stared up at him, and for a fleeting moment, David felt something stir within his hardened exterior. He had no children of his own, no family to speak of anymore, but this small, unassuming boy had a way of bridging the gap between his past and present. As David worked on the toy, Sarah appeared at their shared fence. Her smile was warm but tinged with worry. "I hope he's not bothering you, Mr. Morgan," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. David shook his head. "No trouble at all. Just needs a new screw for the wheel." Sarah hesitated before speaking again, her voice lower. "It's nice to see you out here. Not many people feel comfortable being visible around here anymore." David didn't reply. He didn't need to. The unspoken acknowledgement of the gang's looming presence hung in the air like a storm cloud. Later that evening, inside his dimly lit living room, David sat with an old photo album on his lap. Yellowed photographs of smiling faces stared back at him, their youthful exuberance frozen in time. Beside the album was a small box containing medals, insignias, and letters, artifacts of a life that seemed almost foreign now. He traced his fingers over the silver star pinned to one letter, his mind pulling him back to the ambush. The memory was vivid, as if the dust and heat of that fateful day were still clinging to his skin. He saw his squadmates falling one by one, their shouts blending with the deafening roar of gunfire. He had been trapped, outnumbered, forced to fight for survival while helpless to save the others. "Why me?" he murmured to the silence of the room. The next morning, as David trimmed his hedges, Tommy's father, Mark, approached cautiously. "Morning, David," he began, his voice steady but edged with unease. "I wanted to say thank you for helping Tommy with his toys. He talks about you all the time." David nodded, keeping his focus on the hedge. "He's a good kid." Mark hesitated. "Look, I don't know how much you've seen, but it's getting worse out here. Last week, they cornered a shop owner for not paying them. He's moving out now, just giving up everything." David paused, gripping the shears tightly. He had seen it too, the despair, the desperation. He'd told himself it wasn't his problem, but the lines between avoidance and negligence blurred more every day. "Be careful, Mark," David finally said, his voice firm. "You've got a family to think about." "I will," Mark replied, though the worry in his eyes betrayed his words. As days passed, David found himself drawn more to the small moments with Tommy and his family. They were his only tether to humanity, pulling him from the abyss of his isolation. Yet, the specter of his past and the gang's stranglehold on the neighborhood loomed ever larger. One night, the sound of breaking glass startled David awake. Peering through his window, he saw figures darting between cars. Across the street, someone's porch had been vandalized, a message scrawled in blood-red paint, "Stay in line or pay the price." David clenched his fists, the familiar weight of anger and helplessness settling over him. For years, he had sworn off violence, convinced that picking up a weapon again would make him no better than the forces he once fought against. But the creeping realization that the Iron Street crew would only tighten their grip if unchecked began to gnaw at him. The following morning, as he swept shards of broken glass from his porch, Tommy appeared again. This time, he wasn't holding a broken toy. Instead, he held out a drawing, a crayon sketch of a man who looked suspiciously like David, standing triumphantly with a cane in one hand and a shield in the other. "Is this me?" David asked, surprised. Tommy nodded. "You're the hero." David laughed, a rare sound, but his gaze lingered on the drawing long after Tommy had run back to his house. A hero? He hadn't felt like one in years. Yet, something about Tommy's innocent faith made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a part of him that could still live up to that image. For now, he returned inside, unsure of what the days ahead would bring but acutely aware that change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The Iron Street crew's presence in the neighborhood was no longer just an ominous shadow, it was an open threat. Their heavily tinted black SUVs prowled the streets like predators, each passing vehicle exuding danger. Residents averted their eyes, hurried their steps, and avoided the gang's menacing gaze at all costs. Shop owners, struggling to keep their doors open, whispered stories of escalating protection fees that came with implicit threats of violence. Those who failed to pay often found their storefronts vandalized or their livelihoods destroyed overnight. David Morgan watched it all unfold from the relative safety of his living room window. He hated himself for the quiet relief he felt knowing that his unassuming house and detached demeanor kept him off their radar. But his reprieve came at a cost. He couldn't shake the guilt that churned in his gut every time he saw the fear-stricken faces of his neighbors. One fateful afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, David stepped onto his porch with a mug of black coffee in hand. From his vantage point, he could see the small corner store a block away. The owner, a wiry man in his 50s named Mr. Alvarez, was a fixture of the community, a kind soul who often gave credit to families struggling to make ends meet. Today, however, the usually warm and welcoming shopkeeper looked broken. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shaking as he stood before a group of Iron Street crew enforcers. David recognized the tallest of them, Deacon, a mountain of a man with a shaved head and a jagged scar cutting across his left cheek. Deacon gestured sharply with a gun tucked in his waistband, his voice booming even from a distance. "Times are tough, old man," Deacon sneered, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "But you don't get to slack on your payments. You're a week overdue. What's your excuse?" Mr. Alvarez stammered, his voice barely audible. I had to buy medicine for my wife. Please, I'll get the money, I swear." Deacon cut him off, slamming his fist against a crate of soda bottles. Glass shattered, and David could hear the startled cries of nearby onlookers. "We don't care about your sob stories," Deacon growled. "You either pay up, or we take what's ours." David felt the old familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins, a bitter taste in his mouth as he watched the scene unfold. He clenched his fists tightly, his knuckles whitening. Memories of combat flooded his mind, terrified civilians, bloodied streets, and the helplessness of watching it all while carrying the burden of survival. But David remained frozen. He watched, a passive observer, as Deacon and his crew emptied Mr. Alvarez's register and knocked over shelves on their way out. The shopkeeper crumpled to his knees, cradling his head in his hands. The Iron Street crew climbed into their SUV and roared off, leaving only silence and despair in their wake. That night, David sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at his trembling hands. The coffee mug beside him had gone cold. His thoughts spiraled into the dark recesses of his mind, dredging up the guilt and anger he had buried for so long. "I'm tired of fighting," he muttered to himself. "Tired of losing. But if no one stands up to them, they'll keep taking, keep destroying." His own words echoed back at him, cutting through the fog of his self-pity. It wasn't just the neighborhood under siege, it was his soul. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the responsibility he had shirked since returning from the war. The tipping point came a few days later, when he agreed to accompany Sarah to the nearby market. She had insisted it would be safer if they walked together, though David suspected she just wanted the comfort of his presence. As they maneuvered through the crowded aisles, Sarah spoke in hushed tones about the Iron Street crew's latest demands. "They want $200 more this month," she said, her voice trembling. "Mark and I don't have that kind of money. We barely make ends meet as it is." David nodded grimly. "You've talked to the police?" Sarah gave a bitter laugh. "They don't care. Or they're too scared. Either way, we're on our own." As they exited the store, bags of groceries in hand, a low whistle caught their attention. One of the gang's younger members leaned casually against a lamppost, his arms crossed over his chest. His sharp, predatory grin was as unnerving as it was deliberate. "Got yourself a bodyguard now, lady," the man taunted, nodding toward David. "Careful, old-timer. This neighborhood eats people like you alive." David's response was cold and measured, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And it spits out cowards like you." The gang member's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He straightened up, stepping closer. "Watch yourself, soldier," he hissed. "Scorpion doesn't like heroes messing with his business. Keep your head down, or you'll regret it." David met the man's gaze, unflinching. Years of training and war had taught him the power of silence, the art of intimidation without action. But his stoicism wasn't enough to silence the gnawing realization that the Iron Street crew had no boundaries. They would take and destroy until nothing was left. When David returned home, his quiet sanctuary felt more like a prison. The memory of Mr. Alvarez's defeat, Sarah's tears, and the gang's smirking faces swirled in his mind. He moved to his old footlocker, buried under years of neglect in the back of his closet. As he opened it, the smell of aged leather and metal filled the room. Inside were relics of his former life, a combat knife, faded dog tags, and a set of military fatigues that once fit him like a second skin. He hesitated, his fingers brushing over the knife's hilt. The conflict within him was unbearable. He had sworn never to return to violence, but the world around him was forcing his hand. Every fiber of his being screamed against the idea of fighting again, yet the alternative, doing nothing, felt like a betrayal of the very values he had fought for. Later that evening, as he sat on his porch, Tommy toddled up to him with a freshly drawn picture. This one depicted David standing tall, surrounded by smiling faces. In one hand, he held a shield, in the other, a sword. "You're the hero, Mr. David," Tommy said simply, his innocent eyes shining with hope. David stared at the drawing, his heart heavy. He wasn't a hero, not anymore. But perhaps, for the sake of this child and the fragile hope that still lingered in his corner of the world, he could try to be one again. With a sigh that carried years of pain and weariness, David folded the drawing and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't know what his next step would be, but one thing was certain: he couldn't remain a passive observer any longer. Tommy's giggles echoed through the quiet street, a brief reprieve from the oppressive silence that usually cloaked the neighborhood. David sat on his porch, holding the boy's broken fire truck. His thick hands moved with surprising care as he fixed the cracked plastic. Tommy, perched on the steps, animatedly recounted an imagined adventure where firefighters battled a dragon to save a village. For the first time in years, David found himself smiling at someone else's words, not out of politeness, but genuine amusement. "You've got quite the imagination, Tommy," David said, handing the toy back. Tommy's eyes sparkled as he clutched the truck. "I learned it from you. You're a real hero." The words hit David harder than he expected, a strange mix of warmth and guilt spreading through him. He wasn't a hero. He was a man trying to keep his head down, a man burdened by past failures and the shadows of lives he couldn't save. Yet Tommy's unwavering belief in him planted a seed of responsibility. Sarah appeared at the fence, her usual smile dimmed by worry. "Tommy, come here. Time to wash up." The boy obeyed, but not before waving goodbye to David. Sarah lingered for a moment, her gaze heavy. "Thank you for spending time with him. He looks up to you, you know." David nodded but said nothing, his thoughts already shifting to darker matters. He had seen more gang members patrolling the street lately, their presence more brazen. It was only a matter of time before someone pushed too far and the fragile peace shattered entirely. That night, Sarah knocked on his door. When David opened it, she stood on the porch, clutching her arms tightly around herself. Her eyes were rimmed red, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." David stepped aside, letting her in. She sat at his kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows across her face. "They threatened Mark today," she said, her voice cracking. "He was just parking the car, and one of them told him we needed to pay more next month or else." David's jaw tightened. Did he say what "or else" meant? Sarah shook her head. "He didn't have to. You've seen what they do." "I'm scared, David. I'm scared for Tommy. For all of us." David leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the old footlocker still tucked away in the corner of the room. The tools of his past were within reach, but using them meant becoming someone he had tried so hard to leave behind. "What did the police say?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "They said they'll look into it." Sarah's bitter laugh was barely a whisper. "They won't do anything. Nobody will." Silence stretched between them, the weight of the unspoken truth hanging heavy in the air. Finally, David spoke, his voice low and firm. "I'll keep an eye on things." Sarah looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and doubt. "Thank you. I don't know what we'd do without you." When she left, David sat alone in the dark, grappling with the conflict raging inside him. He had spent years running from violence, from the person he was during the war. But the gang's escalating threats were forcing his hand. He couldn't sit by and watch as the lives of people he cared about unraveled. The breaking point came the next morning. As David tended to his garden, a rock sailed through the air and shattered one of his windows. He turned sharply, spotting a gang member disappearing down the street, laughing as he went. David approached the broken glass and found a message scrawled across his front door in red paint. "Stay out of our way." David's chest tightened as he stared at the words. This wasn't just intimidation, it was a challenge. His hands curled into fists, his breathing ragged as memories of the battlefield surged forward. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, bullies wielding power over the powerless, feeding off fear. It disgusted him then, and it disgusted him now. But fear wasn't all that drove David. It was also anger. Anger at the gang for their arrogance, anger at himself for his inaction, and anger at a world that seemed determined to crush those who tried to do right. That anger ignited something within him, a spark of the man he used to be. Later that day, as David walked to the market, he noticed several neighbors giving him cautious glances. Word of the vandalism had spread, and the community was waiting to see how he would react. Among them was Mrs. Alvarez, the shopkeeper's wife, who placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Morgan," she said softly, "we appreciate what you've done for us. But please, be careful." David nodded, the weight of her words heavy in his chest. "I'll do what I have to," he replied, though even he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table once again, the photo album open in front of him. The faces of his fallen comrades stared back at him, their smiles frozen in time. "What would you do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Would you fight? Or would you walk away?" The silence offered no answers, but deep down, David already knew. Walking away was no longer an option. As he closed the album, a knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find two gang members standing on his porch. Their expressions were smug, their posture threatening. One of them, a wiry man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, stepped forward. "We hear you've been getting too friendly with the neighbors," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Scorpion doesn't like people poking their noses where they don't belong." David stood his ground, his gaze steady. "I don't like people breaking my windows," he replied evenly. The man laughed, a hollow, joyless sound. "Consider it a warning. Keep to yourself, old man. Otherwise," he trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. David didn't respond. He simply watched as the two men sauntered off, their laughter fading into the night. But their words had cemented his resolve. The gang had made it clear they weren't going to stop until the entire neighborhood was under their control. And if no one else was willing to stand up to them, then David would. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of purpose. It wasn't about redemption or proving himself. It was about protecting the people who had given him a reason to hope again. Tommy's laughter, Sarah's trust, Mark's quiet determination, they were worth fighting for. As the moonlight filtered through the broken window, David moved to the footlocker and opened it. His fingers brushed over the combat knife and dog tags. He didn't want to be a soldier again, but the situation left him no choice. Quietly, methodically, he began to prepare. The day had begun like any other in the neighborhood, with the oppressive weight of fear keeping residents indoors and the Iron Street Crew's SUVs prowling the streets. David stood in his yard, quietly watering the patches of flowers he stubbornly maintained, a small rebellion against the decay around him. The faint sound of Tommy's laughter reached him, drawing his attention to the boy playing on the sidewalk with his newly repaired fire truck. For a fleeting moment, David allowed himself to feel at ease. But peace in this part of Los Angeles was as fragile as glass, and it shattered in an instant. A black SUV roared down the street, its tires screeching as it skidded to a halt in front of Tommy's house. Two men jumped out, their faces obscured by bandanas, and moved with chilling precision. Tommy's toy clattered to the ground as one of the men grabbed him roughly by the arm. His screams pierced the air. "Tommy!" Sarah's voice was frantic as she and Mark sprinted from the porch. Mark reached the men first, only to be shoved hard against the car. Sarah tried to pull her son from the kidnapper's grip, but was met with a brutal shove that sent her sprawling to the pavement. David dropped the watering can and ran as fast as his injured leg would allow, his heart pounding. "Let him go," he roared, but his voice was drowned out by Tommy's desperate cries of, "Mr. David." The men shoved Tommy into the SUV and slammed the door. One of them turned to David, pointing a warning finger as the engine revved. "Stay out of this, old man," he growled before climbing into the vehicle. The SUV sped off, leaving tire marks on the asphalt and chaos in its wake. Sarah crawled to her knees, her sobs racking her body as she reached for Mark, who was clutching his ribs and wincing in pain. "They took him, David," she gasped, her tear-streaked face a portrait of anguish. "They took my baby." David's chest heaved with labored breaths as he stood there, powerless and enraged. The Iron Street Crew had crossed a line he couldn't ignore. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I'll get him back," he said, his voice low but resolute. The next hour was a blur of desperation. Sarah banged on neighbors' doors, begging for help, but most refused to even answer. Those who did offered apologies and excuses, their fear overriding any sense of community. Mark, still shaken, managed to contact the police, but their response was predictable, bureaucratic and sluggish. "We'll send someone to investigate," the dispatcher had said, her tone devoid of urgency. David returned to his house, his mind racing. He pulled out the footlocker and opened it, staring at the relics of his past. Medals, photographs, a combat knife. The weight of the dog tags in his hand grounded him as he made his decision. "Never again," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with both fear and conviction. "I won't let another innocent suffer." He spent the evening gathering intel, reaching out to people in the neighborhood who had crossed paths with the gang. Through careful questioning and some subtle bribes, David pieced together a likely location, a derelict warehouse on the edge of town, often used by the Iron Street Crew for their illicit operations. Inside his house, David prepared with meticulous focus. He packed a small bag with supplies, duct tape, a flashlight, and a few crude but effective distractions he had rigged using items from his garage. His combat knife, freshly sharpened, was sheathed and secured to his belt. As he laced up his boots, memories of his military days surged forward. The preparation, the anticipation, the knowledge that every step could be your last, it all came rushing back. But this wasn't a battlefield in some far-off country. This was home. And this time, the stakes were personal. Before leaving, David paused at his porch, taking a deep breath. The streets were eerily quiet, the weight of the gang's dominance suffocating. He thought of Tommy's innocent laughter, of Sarah's desperate pleas, and of the promise he had made to himself. He couldn't fail. Not again. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a hulking structure bathed in shadow and lit only by the dim glow of a single floodlight over the entrance. David parked his truck a few blocks away and approached on foot, his movements slow and deliberate. He scanned the perimeter, noting 2 guards stationed near the entrance. Both were armed, their posture relaxed, their confidence a testament to how rarely they were challenged. David slipped around to the rear of the building, where he found a rusted service door. He used a crowbar to pry it open, wincing at the metallic screech that cut through the silence. Once inside, he crouched low, his senses on high alert. The warehouse reeked of oil and damp concrete, its cavernous space filled with crates and abandoned machinery. He navigated the labyrinth of shadows, avoiding the paths of patrolling guards. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached a room near the back, its door slightly ajar. Inside, he could hear muffled sobs. Peering through the crack, he saw Tommy huddled in the corner, his face streaked with tears. David's hands tightened into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford mistakes. Not with Tommy's life on the line. Slipping into the room, David crouched beside the boy. "Tommy," he whispered, his voice soft but urgent. The boy's tear-filled eyes lit up at the sight of him. "I'm here to take you home." Tommy flung his arms around David's neck, holding on tightly. "I was so scared," he whimpered. David stroked the back of his head. "I know, kid. But you're safe now. We're getting out of here." The sound of approaching footsteps made David's heart skip a beat. He glanced around the room, spotting a metal pipe on the floor. He grabbed it and positioned himself beside the door. When one of the guards entered, David struck without hesitation, knocking the man unconscious before he could react. Cradling Tommy in his arms, David moved quickly through the warehouse. The guards were beginning to notice something was wrong. Voices echoed, and the beam of a flashlight swept dangerously close. David used his makeshift distractions, noisy traps and strategically placed obstacles, to create confusion, buying precious seconds to escape. At the rear exit, David burst into the night, the cool air hitting him like a wave. He sprinted to his truck, Tommy clinging to him tightly. The boy's sobs had subsided, replaced by a quiet trust that David would see him through this. As the engine roared to life and the truck sped away, David glanced at Tommy in the rearview mirror. "You okay back there?" he asked. Tommy nodded, his small voice steady despite the ordeal. "You're my hero, Mr. David." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The boy's words carried a weight he wasn't sure he deserved. But as the warehouse faded into the distance, one thing became clear: he had made the right choice. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in years, David felt something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. The night air was heavy with anticipation as David parked his truck a few blocks from the warehouse. The narrow streets were cloaked in shadow, punctuated by the flicker of a dying streetlight. This time, he wasn't here to rescue Tommy. He was here to end it, to strike at the Iron Street crew in their own lair, to dismantle the foundation of fear they had built in the neighborhood. David stepped out of the truck and secured his supplies. A canvas bag hung from his shoulder, weighted with improvised tools and weapons. His combat knife was sheathed at his side, and a crowbar was tucked into his belt. His heart pounded, but his mind was sharp, his military training flooding back with each deliberate breath. The warehouse stood like a fortress, its high walls and broken windows looming against the night sky. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes illuminated by the occasional swing of flashlights. David crouched behind a row of dumpsters, observing their movements. His fingers brushed against a small detonator in his pocket, connected to a makeshift device he had rigged from fireworks and gasoline cans. It wasn't designed to kill, only to distract. David waited for the right moment, then triggered the detonator. A loud explosion erupted on the far side of the warehouse, followed by a plume of fire and smoke. The guards shouted in confusion, their flashlights converging on the source of the noise. David moved swiftly, slipping through the shadows toward a side entrance. The service door groaned as he pushed it open, the sound masked by the chaos outside. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of towering crates and dimly lit corridors. The air smelled of oil and damp concrete, the oppressive quiet punctuated by the distant voices of the crew investigating the explosion. David moved with purpose, his steps silent. He climbed a rusted staircase to a catwalk that overlooked the main floor. Below, he could see the gang's operation in full swing. Weapons were being loaded into crates, stacks of cash exchanged hands, and Scorpion himself stood at the center of it all, barking orders. Scorpion was a formidable figure, broad-shouldered, with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck and a glint of menace in his dark eyes. He wore a leather jacket studded with metal, and the air around him seemed to hum with authority. David studied him from above, noting his movements and the positioning of his guards. This was the man who had terrorized the neighborhood, the man who had ordered Tommy's abduction. David's focus was interrupted by the creak of footsteps behind him. He turned just in time to see a guard raise a weapon. With reflexes honed by years of combat, David lunged forward, grabbing the barrel and twisting it away. The two men grappled in silence, their movements a deadly dance in the shadows. David used the guard's momentum to slam him into the railing, rendering him unconscious before dragging the body out of sight. The commotion below grew louder as the crew began to realize something was amiss. David descended the stairs, keeping to the edges of the room. He reached a stack of crates and used them for cover, peering around the corner to survey his next move. One of the guards spotted him and raised an alarm, but David was faster. He threw a makeshift smoke grenade, the canister hissing as it filled the area with a thick cloud. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of confusion. David used the smoke to his advantage, darting between cover and taking out guards one by one. He moved like a phantom, his knife striking with precision and efficiency. Each takedown brought him closer to Scorpion, who stood at the center of the storm, his eyes scanning the haze for his unseen adversary. David's leg throbbed with pain, a reminder of his limitations. But he pushed through it, driven by the faces of Sarah, Mark, and Tommy that flashed in his mind. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for redemption, for justice, for the community that had given him a reason to care again. A guard lunged at him from the smoke, a steel pipe swinging dangerously close. David ducked, the pipe glancing off the edge of a crate. He retaliated with a swift uppercut, followed by a blow to the guard's ribs. The man staggered, and David finished him with a knee to the face. The clang of the pipe hitting the floor echoed through the room, drawing Scorpion's attention. "So you're the hero," Scorpion growled, his voice cutting through the din. He stepped forward, flanked by two of his men. "I've heard about you, old man. Thought you could play soldier in my territory." David emerged from the smoke, his knife glinting in the faint light. His voice was steady, unwavering. "This ends tonight." Scorpion chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "You think you can take me on? Alone?" He gestured to his men, who spread out, surrounding David. "You're just one man." David's eyes flicked between his opponents, calculating his odds. Sometimes one man is all it takes. The fight erupted in a blur of motion. Scorpion's men charged, their weapons raised. David ducked under the swing of a crowbar, countering with a quick strike to the attacker's knee. The man fell, clutching his leg, as David spun to block a punch from the second. He drove his elbow into the man's jaw, the force sending him sprawling. Scorpion watched, his expression darkening as his men fell. "Impressive," he admitted, stepping forward. "But you won't walk out of here alive." The two men faced off, circling each other like predators. Scorpion swung first, his fists powerful but slow. David dodged, landing a series of precise blows to Scorpion's ribs. But the gang leader was tough, shaking off the hits and retaliating with a brutal punch to David's side. Pain radiated through his body, but David refused to falter. The fight was savage, neither man holding back. Scorpion's strength clashed with David's skill, the sound of their struggle echoing through the warehouse. Finally, David saw his opening. He feinted left, drawing Scorpion off balance, and delivered a decisive strike to his throat. The gang leader stumbled, gasping for air, and fell to his knees. David stood over him, his breath ragged, his knife poised. "This is for the people you've terrorized," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. He hesitated, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Instead of delivering a killing blow, he knocked Scorpion unconscious with the hilt of his knife. Sirens wailed in the distance, the police finally arriving. David stepped back, his mission complete. He had done what he came to do, and the neighborhood would no longer live in fear. As he limped out of the warehouse, the first rays of dawn broke over the city, signaling a new beginning. The sun had fully risen by the time David's truck rolled back into the neighborhood. Its rays painted the broken sidewalks and graffiti-stained walls in golden light, as if attempting to cleanse the scars of the past. Inside the truck, Tommy sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching the fire truck David had repaired for him. His small hands trembled, but his expression carried a mix of exhaustion and relief. David pulled into the driveway of Sarah and Mark's house, the weight of the past night etched into the lines of his face. He had fought harder than he thought his body would allow, his injuries screaming for rest, but he knew he couldn't stop yet. Not until Tommy was home, safe and sound. As the truck came to a stop, the front door burst open. Sarah and Mark ran out, their faces pale and frantic. The moment Sarah saw Tommy, her knees buckled, and Mark caught her just in time. David opened the passenger door, helping Tommy climb down. The boy ran to his mother, wrapping his arms tightly around her as she wept openly. "My baby," Sarah sobbed, holding him as if she would never let go. Mark joined them, his arms encircling both his wife and son, his own tears falling freely. David stepped back, giving the family space. He leaned against his truck, watching the scene with a quiet sense of accomplishment. For the first time in years, he felt something akin to peace. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. Sarah approached him, her face still wet with tears, but her expression one of profound gratitude. "David, how can we ever thank you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You brought our son back. You saved him." David shook his head, his voice low and rough. "Seeing him safe is all I need." The sound of sirens drew closer, cutting through the morning stillness. The police had finally arrived, too late to be of any help but still eager to piece together what had happened. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, curiosity and cautious hope flickering in their eyes. They whispered to each other, their gazes shifting between the sirens and David, the man who had faced the Iron Street crew and lived to tell the tale. As squad cars pulled up, officers stepped out, their expressions a mixture of professionalism and disbelief as they surveyed the aftermath of David's night. A sergeant approached him, his clipboard in hand. "We got a call about an incident at the warehouse," he said, studying David carefully. "The crew's been dismantled, Scorpion's in custody. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" David met the sergeant's gaze, his eyes steady. "Just a neighbor trying to protect his street," he replied simply. The officer studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Well, whatever happened, you saved a lot of people today. We'll take it from here." As the officers began their work, Sarah and Mark ushered Tommy back inside, but not before the boy turned and ran back to David. He threw his arms around David's waist, his voice muffled against his jacket. "Thank you, Mr. David," he whispered. "You're my hero." David placed a hand on the boy's head, his throat tightening with emotion. "Stay safe, Tommy. Be brave." The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. With Scorpion and his enforcers behind bars, the Iron Street crew's grip on the neighborhood crumbled. Shops reopened their doors, children played outside again, and the tension that had plagued the streets began to dissipate. Neighbors who had once lived in isolation started to connect, their shared relief forging a sense of community. For David, the transition was quieter but no less significant. He spent his time repairing the damage to his home and helping the Alvarezes rebuild their vandalized store. People began to approach him on the street, offering words of thanks and gestures of kindness, a hot meal, a helping hand with his garden. One evening, as he sat on his porch, Sarah and Mark came by with Tommy in tow. The boy was holding a colorful flyer, which he handed to David with a shy smile. "We're having a block party," Tommy explained. "It's to celebrate. And we want you to come." David looked at the flyer, the cheerful words inviting neighbors to gather, to paint over the graffiti and reclaim their streets. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of his solitude pulling at him. But as he glanced at Tommy's hopeful face and the warmth in Sarah and Mark's eyes, he nodded. "I'll be there." The block party was a turning point. Families came together, painting over gang tags with vibrant murals, planting flowers in neglected spaces, and sharing food and stories. David found himself drawn into conversations, his guarded nature softening as he listened to his neighbors' gratitude and resilience. As the sun set, Tommy tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. David, can you teach me how to fight like you?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with admiration. David knelt down, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I'll teach you how to be strong," he said, his voice gentle. "But real strength isn't just about fighting. It's about protecting what matters." The crowd began to gather around him, their faces illuminated by string lights that crisscrossed the street. Someone handed David a microphone, urging him to speak. He hesitated, unused to the attention, but then cleared his throat. "We've been through a lot," he began, his voice steady. "But what happened here wasn't just about me. It was about all of us standing together, refusing to let fear control our lives. This is our home, and we're taking it back." The crowd erupted into cheers, their collective voice a powerful declaration of defiance and hope. For the first time, David felt like he was part of something larger than himself, a community, a family. As the night wore on, he found himself at ease among the people he had once kept at a distance. Sarah brought him a plate of food, and Mark handed him a cold drink. Tommy climbed onto his lap, chattering excitedly about his plans to become a firefighter, a soldier, and a hero, just like Mr. David. David smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. He had found his purpose, not in the violence of his past, but in the quiet strength of rebuilding a life worth living. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.